Okay, so my talk kind of follows on quite well from Catherine's. I'm going to talk about some different release methods that we trialled with brushtail possums reintroduced to the Flinders Ranges. So brushtail possums were historically distributed across most of Australia. Unfortunately, they've now disappeared from more than half of their historical distribution. So you can see on the map, the hashed area indicates areas where possums have become locally extinct, and this is mostly pronounced in the arid and semi-arid zones. And the threats to their persistence include introduced predators such as cats and foxes, altered fire regimes, hunting and persecution. There's been a big historical fur trade, habitat loss and alteration, and competition with introduced herbivores such as rabbits, and also competition with domestic stock, including cattle. So a reintroduction involves returning a species to an area in which it used to occur but has disappeared. And they're an important conservation tool for reversing the decline of threatened species, but in order to be successful, the original causes of decline have to be addressed. And the success rate of reintroductions is typically quite low. So a review by Jeff Short in 2009 found a success rate of 54% in Australia. And because of this low success rate, it's really important that we identify any potential techniques that can be used to improve reintroduction success. So soft releases are one of these alternative release methods. They're also referred to as a delayed release, and they usually involve some sort of period of confinement at the release site, and usually supplementary food and or shelter. And so soft releases have been linked to small dispersal distances, reduced post-release weight loss, high survival and smaller home ranges compared to animals that are hard released or just immediately released at the release site. However, some studies don't support this, or they've found soft releases to have lower success than hard releases. There is a common perception, probably because of the choice of language, that a soft release is intuitively beneficial, but the data doesn't always support this. The responses by different species to alternative release methods are highly variable, therefore generalisations are difficult and probably unreliable, so we really need to test it on a per species basis. And soft releases are logistically and financially quite expensive. So to justify their use, we really need to demonstrate that they have some benefit for that species. So the aim of this study was to determine the influence of 3 different release methods on survival, dispersal, post-release weight changes and reproduction in brushtail possums reintroduced to a semi-arid area. And as Catherine mentioned, our study site was the Flinders Ranges National Park. And so this area has undergone effective fox control for more than 20 years now under bounce back, and this facilitated the reintroduction of the species to the area. So 79 possums were translocated to the park from Yucumara Sanctuary, which you can just see on the blue dot on the left. And the sanctuary there has no mammalian predators present. And the release sites went all the way from Wilpena Pound in the south of the park up to Bunyaroo Gorge. So of the 79 possums that were translocated, 48 of them were radio-collared. All possums were released in male-female pairs. And so 16 of those, 8 male, 8 female, were soft release. So they were housed in 10 by 10 metre pens for 11 days. They were provided with supplementary food. They also had nest boxes in the pens, and each of the pens had some natural hollows in red gums as well, and those pens were opened after 11 days. Food continued to be provided daily for the first 3 weeks, and then every couple of days for another week after that, so they were supplementary fed for a month. 16 possums, 8 male, 8 female, were released in nest boxes. And so they were either caught in nest boxes that they were already using at Yucumara Sanctuary, where nest boxes had been put up 7 months prior to the translocation, and some extra ones were placed into nest boxes after the collar had been fitted, and then they were translocated in those boxes. And the boxes were hung on adjacent trees, so again in the male-female pairs. And then 16 possums were hard released, so they were just let go at adjacent hollow-bearing trees. Unfortunately, 4 of the soft release males escaped quite early on, so the sample size for the males of the soft release is down to 4. So the nest box release method can be considered an alternative, cheaper form of soft release, which is much more affordable for reintroduction projects if it works. So to monitor the population, we trapped all the radio-collared possums, or as many as possible, at day 10, 20, 30, 60 and 90 to really capture the weight change data and to monitor their reproduction. They were radio tracked to their shelter sites approximately weekly, and we got a mortality fix on the collared possums daily for the first month and then every 2 or 3 days after that. So this graph just shows the time since translocation on the x-axis and the distance from release site on the y-axis. There was no difference in the distances dispersed by males and females, so the data was pooled. There was no significant difference in the final dispersal distance 12 weeks after release of possums between the different treatment groups. However, the delayed release possums took longer to stabilise, to maintain a stable distance from their release site compared to the nest box release and hard release possums. So they took about 6 weeks to stabilise their distance, whereas the nest box release possums took about 4 weeks and the hard release possums only took about 3 weeks before they stopped moving around. There was also a significant difference in the final dispersal distance 12 weeks after release for males based on their size. So males that were larger than average remained closer to their release site than males that were smaller than average, and this is possibly related to dominance, or it could be that the smaller males were younger and therefore at an age where dispersal is quite normal. So this graph just shows the same data slightly differently. We've got categorical distances from release site on the x-axis and the proportion of possums in each release treatment on the y-axis. So there was high variability within each treatment group, and you can see there was sort of a bimodal distribution with the soft release possums or the delayed release possums, with about a third of them staying within 500 metres of their release site, but then almost a third of them dispersing more than 3 kilometres from their release site. So no release treatment was successful in preventing hyperdispersal away from release sites, with 7 possums dispersing more than 3 kilometres from their release site. One of these actually went 17 kilometres. So this suggests that a proportion of the population will respond to translocation this way, regardless of which release methods you use. And some studies suggest that males are more likely to hyperdisperse than females, but in this case, 5 out of the 7 possums that hyperdispersed were females, so that certainly wasn't the case here. So these graphs just show weight change over time since release, with males and females separately, because the females, a lot of them had pouch young. Just interpret the weights at day 90 for females with caution, because a lot of the pouch young had emerged from the pouch by then, so they were weighed separately, which is probably why there's that drop in weight. So there was no significant difference in weight between treatments for any of the sampling periods. All possums had lost weight after 10 days, but by about 60 days after release, most of them were actually heavier than they were at translocation. So as Catherine mentioned, many of the females were translocated with small pouch young, and all of these were retained post-release, so there was no difference between treatment groups. Several females that didn't have pouch young at the time of release gave birth shortly after, and this was across all treatment groups as well. There was also no difference in survival between treatment groups, with high adult survival for the first 3 months. However, when we radio tracked the possums, we gave their shelter sites a safety score of 1 to 3. So 1 was considered unsafe and accessible by predators, and 3 was considered safe and was usually a good tree hollow. So this graph shows the proportion of possums in each treatment group using the safe shelter sites with a score of 3. So you can see that initially some unsafe shelter sites were used. There were some possums that were sheltering in the burnt out base of river red gums or up the top of calatrus trees in the open. And this behaviour is consistent with other brushtail possum translocations, and is one of the reasons that we predicted that soft releases might be beneficial for the species. So had predators, and particularly foxes, not been controlled at the release site, it is possible that a higher mortality might have been observed for the nest box release and immediate release possums in those first few days, whereas the soft release possums were protected from mammalian predators by the pens which had a floppy top fence. So the reason that the soft release possums might have taken longer to reach a stable distance from release site might have been that they were hanging around for the supplementary food, but we didn't see the same sort of trend for the nest box release possums, which were also provided with supplementary food, so there's probably something else at play there as well. It's possible that some of the possums found confinement stressful, which might explain the bimodal distribution of distances in those soft release possums, with some of them coping quite well and staying close to their release site, and then some of them just absolutely hating it and getting out of there as soon as the pens were opened. But at the end of the day, we didn't find any benefit in soft releasing brushtail possums, in this case where foxes are absent. So just to conclude, soft releases are logistically and financially expensive. Those soft release pens cost in excess of $3,000, so to keep using them you really need to justify it, and in this case they didn't provide any benefit. So immediate releases are suitable for brushtail possums only when foxes are effectively absent and shelter sites are plentiful at release sites. And thanks to everyone that helped with the project.
Okay, any questions? Yes.
How do you manage to hold animals that become couch jump without losing your fingers?
We've almost lost a few fingers, and most of the time it's a two-person job. If you get a really quiet one, you can do it yourself, but yeah, lots of practice and steep learning curve.
Is the time spent in the pens counted as time in the free, like after release?
So that was the starting point for the weight change, but the distances for the soft release possums was from when the pen was opened.
Was it 3,000 per pen or 3,000?
Yeah, just over 3,000 per pen.
Per pen.
Yep.
Should point out that they were actually erected for the
They were.
in a quoll release. Did they make a difference for the quoll release? Do we know? Sorry? Okay. So they were recycled pens. Any other questions? Okay.
Thank you.